Have a doctor in the house, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Duncan Webb, former professor, lawyer, and social activist, someone known for his works within climate change legislations and the Labour Party's MP for my former place of residence back in the day, Christchurch Central. Welcome, Dr. Duncan Webb.
Thank you very much for that. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui. I think I'm the most boring person on this call because when I hear the fabulous stories and poetry and also just Golriz and Ibrahim's amazing stories as well, and of course Te Anu's got a lot to bring here, and I guess I don't have the narratives that they have, but I think that's an important part of this story here tonight. And can I just say I really congratulate the PYA for this event, and also just for the approach that you bring, and just the, if you look on this Zoom and the work that you do, just the diversity of the people here, all ages, all ethnicities and colours and backgrounds, and also just the positive approach where you've really tried to emphasise, and rightly so, the richness and depth of Palestinian culture. And I must say, I think it was Basma's poem made me quite hungry because I haven't had dinner yet, and the food, I know some of it, and it sounded delicious, especially the way you spoke about it. But look, I guess if you think about this, like I say, I can't bring what some other people bring to this story, but this is a battle for hearts and minds, and the stories we've heard today can absolutely win and break hearts. And I think there's also, I guess I'm bringing my own background, which, as you've said, is an academic and a professor of law. And I just want to say we've got to win minds as well. And so there's a place for all of those voices. And I guess what I would say is this, that and I was interested, Te Anu, that yes, I did get the email from the evangelical fellow in the Hawke's Bay, I think, which I imagine many MPs get. And we need to make sure that we have the facts and that we apply, really careful principles to it and engage in careful and reasoned dialogue. And I'm not saying that I'm certainly not saying, absolutely not saying that there's no place for protest, that there's no place for loud voices on the steps of Parliament, and all of those really fantastic things that go on. But there's also a place which is less oppositional and more engaging. And we know that a lot of the time when people are there to be persuaded, they're persuaded not so much by what we say, but also by a recognition that we listen. So where there are people out there who are willing to engage, I think there's two things. Firstly, we need to be well equipped to do that. And I guess my own story is I didn't join Parliament to be a Palestinian activist, far from it, right? I guess I'd always taken an interest in history, an interest in law, an interest in human rights, and an interest in international law and principle. And when you put that into a pot and mix it, you come out with a pretty simple result when we look at the Palestinian question, right? But you do have to know those facts. And there's a lot of the narrative from some people, from people who don't want to recognize the right of Palestine to exist, doesn't recognize, it's undermining in that it doesn't recognize Palestinian history. It doesn't recognize Palestinian culture. It doesn't recognize the uniqueness of a Palestinian way of life. So I guess one of my observations would be that make sure we know our history, and that you know your history in particular, and not in a superficial way, but in a way that recognizes that the justness over many centuries of what has gone on, but particularly what happened in the 20th century, because in many ways, Israel has stolen the narrative in terms of the heroicness of the creation of the state of Israel. That is still a narrative that's powerful, and the tragedy and misery of the loss of self-determination of the Palestinian people, whilst we here want to speak it loud, it's not often heard in the way it should be. So I think we need to reclaim that in some ways. And only then, when we talk about Palestinian statehood and the right of any people to peace, dignity, security, and also just the right to live a life that's a flourishing life that they choose for themselves. Only when we have that background do I think we can do that. And so I guess really my point is, when we know our history, and also the second point is this, in my approach, is to know the kind of framework, the international framework and the legal framework, and then embark on an argument in every avenue we can, whether it be in Parliament, and Golra's talked about the motion, whether it's in the United Nations, and New Zealand has done good work there, though there's more to do, or whether it be in those everyday actions that we take. And I know John Minto's on the call, and he's been a huge advocate of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And look, we've made good progress there, right? The New Zealand superannuation fund divested from a number of Israeli assets on the basis that they were investing in or supporting West Bank settlements. And whilst it was a small corner of in the newspaper in New Zealand, internationally it was recognised. In Israel it was recognised, and we need to do more of that, because it's by every one of those small steps on a whole lot of different fronts that we do that. And I mean, absolutely endorse the calling out of what's happening in Israel over the past couple of months, not only the further illegal settlements, and I think it's really important that every time we say settlements we say illegal, because that's what they are, right? There's no basis for them to be built on Palestinian territory that should be a Palestinian state. And also, and this is really important, what Israel has done in terms of trying to suppress the Palestinian voice and the Palestinian record, because we know that in identifying and naming human rights organizations in Palestine recently as terror organizations, that brings the kind of force of the state to suppress the voice and the records that are being made of the wrongs that are occurring. Because the point is this, that if we are going to win this argument on an international stage, we absolutely need the evidence to do so, and that's what is being interfered with. So I think, we've got to remember the past and argue for the present, and only then I think can we win the future. And for me, I recognise that Golra's wins hearts, and I'll try and win minds. How about that? Kia ora.